Hi, and welcome to Across the Canon. Today we are joined by Dr. Gary Anderson. Dr. Anderson has served as the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Thought at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of this book, Christian Doctrine and the Old Testament, Theology in Service of Biblical Exegesis. And his most recent work is a book called That I May Dwell Among Them, Incarnation and Atonement in the Tabernacle Narrative. Dr. Anderson, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's a joy to have you here. And I've really enjoyed your work. It's a theme that I love when we talk about the tabernacle, the temple, the dwelling presence of God. We're going to get into a lot of that. But first, I'd like to start off with a little bit about you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey into biblical scholarship and what brought you there?
So I was raised United Methodist and went to a United Methodist college, Albion College in Michigan. Like many colleges and universities founded by mainline denominations, it had a very weak relationship with the Methodist Church, but it still, existed. It had a religion department and had, scholars in the religion department that taught the Bible. And, it was so far back, 1973 is when I began my undergraduate studies, which is, I think, almost over 50 years ago. Why I took the introduction to the Old Testament in the fall semester of my first year, I couldn't tell you. If I gave you an explanation, it would certainly be on the basis of what happened to me afterwards. I can't, for the life of me, describe what I was like then, but I can say, I think with considerable confidence, that the course made an enormous impression on me. And I became, incredibly interested, in the Bible and in questions of religion in general. I mean, when I began as an undergraduate, my academic strengths definitely lied in mathematics and the sciences. That's where my natural talents were, but I wasn't engaged in any serious way. When I took those courses, I did well in them, but they didn't really send me in any existential fashion. Whereas courses on religion, philosophy, Shakespeare in the English department, dealing with, the problems of being or the challenge of being a human in the modern world or the Shakespeare Elizabethan world, that just fascinated me to no end. And so I slowly, over the course of my first couple of years, navigated to that kind of work and away from the sciences. The Bible became, the book or the subject that I was most interested in. And I slowly was kind of taken in by it. Now, if someone had told me my very first semester, all the languages I would have to learn and everything I would have to do to become a scholar in the field of biblical studies, I probably would have run and never done it. But you kind of slowly enter that world, and by the time you've learned one language or two, you're in too deep to get out. But I have no regrets. I love studying the Bible and have for the 50 years since that course. I also, I can't remember when this began, but I was always very interested in Judaism, both the Judaism of the ancient world and Judaism of the modern world. And my study of the Old Testament, I couldn't tell you, again, I don't remember that far back, if that was a factor in choosing the Old Testament over the New. I'm guessing probably not. But as I matured, the two certainly came together, my interest in the Old Testament and my interest in the Jewish religion and Jewish faith. And that was actually played a huge role eventually in my decision to become Roman Catholic, because I guess what I learned the deeper I got into the study of the Bible was, well, a couple of things. First of all, from a historical critical perspective, which was definitely my perspective. I was not, by any means an inerrantist or, fundamentalist. I saw that the more you studied the Bible in terms of its historical origins, the more it left the world of Judaism and Christianity, which of course was my reason for studying the Bible in the first place. And I also realized that, what Jewish readers saw, certainly in the Old Testament, wasn't always the same thing that I would see as a Christian reader. And my confrontation, you might want to say, with that fact wasn't to say that Jews were wrong and Christians were right, but rather that the book, the Old Testament, as it were, allowed for a latitude of, considerable variance and difference. And it was actually productive, I felt then and still feel today, to attend carefully to what Jews say when they read the Old Testament. So I guess from those experiences, I came to see that, you really, when you read the Bible, you don't just read the Bible on its own, but you read the Bible within the context of a church, or if you're Jewish, within the context of the synagogue. And it's really the church or the synagogue that provides the framework that allows the reader to see the theological profundity of the book. So I guess in my own faith journey, you might want to say, once I made, that discovery for myself, I was already Roman Catholic, though it took me a while to actually, make the plunge. But I saw that the Bible, really required an ecclesial, frame in which to be read profitably. And the longer I've studied the Bible, the more I guess I'm convinced of that factor. Coming to the University of Notre Dame, of course, was fantastic, and reading the Bible in the context of the lived, Catholic religion, or reading the Bible in the context of the lived Jewish religion. And I like that too. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. That's really what animates me as a scholar.
Very good. So as you sat down, as you worked your way through this book, because you talked about how the historical critical method, which was basically started in the 1800s or so, was an approach to taking at the least charitable view, an almost atheistic approach to the Bible, right? Where we're trying to take the supernatural out of it, and we're really just trying to get at what happened historically. Am I about right on that?
So it's right and not right. I guess I would say that the historical critical method wanted to put the best face forward on it, wanted to take the notion of human agency most seriously. We can think of the writing of the Bible as really operating under the principle of what we might call dual causality. That is, they're human, this worldly elements that led to its composition, and then of course divine inspiration as well. And I think the best example really to see that in the Bible itself is 2 Kings 17. I love to use this in class, which is the story of the fall of the northern kingdom in 721. And the first several verses, maybe 6 verses, I can't remember, I don't have the text in front of me right now, but they describe the fall of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians in purely historical, socio-political terms. That is, the turning away from the Assyrian suzerain, seeking help from, other suitors, the Syrian suzerain being enraged, and then the kingdom of the north falling to Assyrian onslaught. From a historian, I mean, that's certainly a plausible way of explaining the fall of the northern kingdom, and the Bible is happy to describe it in that fashion at the beginning of chapter 17. But the second half of chapter 17 is a theological explanation, which is all about Israel's infidelity. Over the courses of several centuries, God warned Israel through the prophets time and time again. Israel refused to pay heed to those prophets. So in the end, God's patience simply, was at an end. And God, ordered the Assyrian soldiers, of course, to invade and destroy the kingdom. So the Bible presents both of those as explanations. You might want to say the modern historical critical explanation is more interested in the former. The former isn't untrue, and it's not necessarily atheistic, but it can be if you think that's all that's there, right?
Right.
So I guess that's how I would put it, is that I think historical critical method wants to put a premium on human agency, not necessarily dismiss the divine element, but to at least put it in brackets for a moment, to explain as much as one can from the perspective of human agency. Now, you're certainly correct that once one starts to bracket, we might want to say, divine agency in reading the Bible, that can quickly become, the sole paradigm.
Right.
And then the historical critical method can take a turn that's quite secular and, not just in a neutral sense, but often, very hostile to a religious or theological explanation. And obviously that is of no interest to me. But the historical critical method as a method that simply wants to take seriously human agency,
Mhm.
that I'm fully invested in. And I think, a modern reading of the Bible has to, grapple with that.
And I think even Pope Benedict XVI was pretty clear on that we need the historical critical method, but like you said, it can't be in a way that eschews doctrine,
Right.
and the role of the church in handing on that doctrine. Uh,
Exactly.
and so I think you do a really good job in this book of working those two together, and showing how Christian theology can help us go into the Old Testament and understand things better. And so, what is like big picture? What's like one idea that you would hope for? Let's say the Christian in the pew, to take away from the work that you've done in your book here.
So I think the book operates at maybe two levels. So um, I did write it primarily thinking of people who are familiar with biblical scholarship. So if we're
Mhm.
going to go back to your initial question, one of the things that modern scholarship in its more hard secular edged fashion looks with great suspicion on is the introduction of any kind of theological category to shed light on a biblical story. This is usually referred to as an example of eisegesis, that is,
Mhm.
reading into, the Greek preposition eis, into, rather than exegesis, reading out of the text what the text wants to say. And I guess what I tried to show in the book is that, through the, I don't know, 8 to 10 chapters, I can't remember how many there were, different stories in the Bible that can be read more deeply and profoundly if one has the proper theological lens to understand them. And it doesn't mean that the Bible is simply a kind of passive instrument and that the theological lens is doing all the work, but it's really a back and forth that the biblical text is illumined, I want to suggest in this book, by that theological lens, but the biblical text then also will further deepen and provide nuance for that, theological concept or trope. So it's a two-way conversation. So one of my earliest chapters in the book is on the question of divine simplicity, that God
Mhm.
doesn't change over time, whereas we can find all kinds of examples in the Bible, and many modern historical critics love to point this out, where it says God repented of this or that. So it seems clear, at least at first blush, that the biblical theological doctrine must be wrong. God clearly does change his mind. He's not, omniscient, et cetera, et cetera. But what I tried to show in that chapter is that, that one of the reasons why the Bible will tell stories of God, quote unquote, changing his mind is that there's stories that revolve around the notion of intercessory prayer and God's, uh, coordinating his providential plan with, the lives and real human agency of the persons that he's in relationship with. And what we see in those stories, well, I won't give the full contents of the chapter here, but what we see in those chapters is, a concerted attempt to establish, the notion of God's coherence and unchanging, being or character, but displayed in a way that makes him responsive to human sin and human righteousness, where there is a relationship, so that language that at first blush would seem to call into question a standard historical theological truism actually, I think, can reaffirm that truism if we have the ability to understand properly the anthropomorphic language that the Bible uses. And so, I mean, that's really what the book does. We kind of, go through, one example after another, trying to show how theological concepts, aren't, trying to force the Bible into a rigid mold that the Bible, is very unnatural to the Bible, but actually quite the opposite. So that's one level that's really written for theologians, biblical scholars who are beset by that problem. But the chapters themselves, I think, are very much available to a layperson who's not invested in that, theological dilemma. In other words, each chapter deals with the problem that the layperson, I think, would, share or ponder, even if they didn't know the issues that beset the guild of professional theologians. And average Bible readers are puzzled by stories about how God changes his mind. What does that mean? And that chapter that I wrote, I think, will serve well, Bible readers who find those comments to be puzzling.
Well, and I think one of the questions that any Christian is going to have to grapple with is, how do I understand the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament? And you got a wonderful quote on that on page 129. And so I'd love to have you unpack that a bit. And I'll read it here. So on 129, you say, the relationship between the two testaments is not simply predictive, but figural. What I mean by this is that the Old Testament is more than simply a set of prophecies about the coming Messiah. It also provides the Christian reader with a set of theological premises that retain their per se voice even after the advent of Israel's Messiah. Indeed, we could state the matter more strongly. Certain theological subjects raised in the New Testament necessitate a return to the Old Testament in order for their contents to be understood. Consequently, we can say that the Old Testament does more than simply anticipate the New. Rather, it fills in areas that the New merely gestures toward. Now, you say that in the context of two chapters that I absolutely loved, that are weaving together the idea of the tabernacle and the temple with Christology and Mariology. But could you unpack a bit more, like flesh out like what you're describing there in the way that the Old Testament like fills in theological ideas that the New Testament is merely gesturing towards?
Right. So thank you for raising that issue. First of all, I didn't address it in this book because he hadn't written the essay yet, but Pope Benedict Emeritus XVI, one of the final things he wrote was on the priesthood, the Catholic priesthood. And one of the things he argued in that essay, it's a marvelous essay, is that one of the reasons why the office of priesthood has become so problematic in the modern period for Catholics is because they've lost the ability to read the Old Testament, to see how the early church read the Old Testament. And what's happened is that the Catholic Church or Catholic thinkers have been captive to really you might want to say, a format established within the Protestant Reformation. In other words, the New Testament itself doesn't use the word priest to refer to the leaders of the church. So for many of the Protestant reformers, well, the Church of England would be an exception here, they, invoked a totally different, nomenclature. But Benedict shows in this essay that, the understanding of the church's leadership, as the office of the priest is quite early. You have it already in First Clement from the end of the first century. In other words, predates some of the final books of the New Testament itself. And it brings, to bear the full nomenclature of the Old Testament about priesthood, priest, Levite, high priest, etc., to describe the leaders, of the church. And that's very important for Benedict, that this is a very ancient custom in the church and that it does come from the Old Testament. And the same thing would be true, he doesn't mention this in his essay, but also church architecture. The New Testament doesn't say anything about how to build a church. I mean, the early Christians worshiped in houses or they went to synagogue. But once Christianity became a licit religion in the wake of Constantine, we know from Eusebius, they started, thinking about building public buildings, which was very difficult to do beforehand. Where in Scripture were they going to learn how to do such? Well, they looked back at the tabernacle narrative as the model for, how one would construct sacred space. So the book of Exodus, Leviticus not only, gives us the vocabulary for describing the hierarchy of the church, but it also gives us, the blueprint, we might want to say, for the church building that Christians are going to worship in. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I didn't make all of those points in the Christian Doctrine book, but I do point there in that chapter to the work of two Protestant exegetes who are deeply influential on me. One, Brevard Childs of Yale University, and then his student, Christopher Seitz, who were very, very emphatic about the importance of the Old Testament witness and continuing to shape the way in which Christian theology was to be done and expounded, and that the Old Testament wasn't simply predictive of elements in the New. If that's its only role, well, once the prediction has come true, what's the need for the the prediction itself? It's simply, it's pointing to the new, but once the new comes on the scene, it no longer needs to point, right? There has to be a deeper function to the Old Testament. So one of the essays that was very influential on me, and I've always used it in teaching, was Chris Seitz's essay on, the church's eschatology and the study of Christ's advent at Christmas. And he points out that in, the readings that accompany, the season of Advent leading up to the birth of Christ, especially at the beginning of Advent, the verses chosen are never about, the birth of the Messiah on December 25th, but they're about Christ's coming in glory. And why is that the case? Well, the church recognized that many of the predictions, with respect to the Messiah, what the Messiah would accomplish in the Old Testament, weren't fulfilled in the first Advent, right? There had to be a second Advent. So as Seitz puts it, the New Testament writers and the church deferred to, in his case, Isaiah's larger eschatological frame. It's not a matter of Isaiah simply, a virgin shall conceive, and then Isaiah's work is done. No, Isaiah talks about the lion lying down with the lamb, all kinds of things about what the Messianic age will look like when it comes to its, final termination. And it includes, of course, a description of, human life that exceeds what Christ accomplished in his first Advent. So for Seitz, this is the perduring value of Isaiah. He provides, as he puts it, the eschatological frame both for Jews and Christians in a sense, and the Catholic Church has affirmed this. Jews and Christians, in a sense, both pray for the coming of the Messiah, of course, in different ways. Christian Church affirms that the Messiah has already come, and we know what he'll look like when he comes again, but we do pray for his coming again. And we pray for his coming again for very similar reasons that the Jews pray for the coming of the Messiah in the first place. So all of those are good examples of, how the Old Testament isn't simply predictive, but we go back to see what is the kind of, eschatological vision that the Old Testament has about the consummation of human history. And that provides us, a frame in which to put, place, and understand the figure of Jesus Christ. And I think by extension, now, I don't know how Seitz or Childs would think about this. They certainly weren't Catholic, but I think you could make the same point about the hierarchy of the church, the design of church buildings, the understanding of the Eucharist, once it's identified as a sacrifice, the body and blood of Christ. Well, then we can go back and look in Old Testament texts. What is the nature of sacrificial flesh? What happens to it when it touches the altar? It changes, its ontological stature changes. And all of those things, then you have to ask your question, does that just disappear when the Old Testament ends? Or is this describing to us something that's eternal about the way in which God is related to the material world and the sacramental elements of that material world? And I think for Catholics, the answer to that question is quite clear, that the God of the Old Testament remains, the God of the New. And the way in which, people in the Old Testament, approached items that were holy provides the framework for how we'll act in the New Testament with respect, and in the early church, to items that are holy.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because in these two chapters in particular, you spent a good amount of time, probably not as much as the book that you've recently done, but we can dig into some of that too, describing the way that the Old Testament Israelites would have interacted with the temple and the tabernacle and the way holiness worked there. And you set that as a framework for us to be able to better understand the incarnation and how we understand Mary. So could you unpack a little bit for us that sort of temple tabernacle theology and the way it was understood in Israelite worship?
Yes, one of the things I deal with both in this book and in my newest book, of course, is the way in which when God inhabits a place, the place itself is transformed.
Mhm.
So we can see that nicely illustrated in Psalm 48, where the pilgrim coming to the city of Jerusalem doesn't simply go to the temple where God invisibly dwells, but he stares and gawks at the buildings that surround the temple. Somehow, everything having to do with the temple is absorbed an element of his holiness. I referred to this perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek in my most recent book as what I call ontological leakage. The notion that somehow the ontos, the being of God. Ontology is simply a fancy Greek word to refer to the nature of someone's being. But the being of God isn't simply housed in the inner recesses of that temple, but the glory of God, his ontological dimension, is so overwhelming and overpowering, it actually spreads to everything in the near vicinity. The example I gave actually in this book, if you wanted to explain it at a much more everyday, kind of quotidian fashion, would be to take a look at, a YouTube video of, for example, Steph Curry coming off the court and seeing some 10-year-old admirer on the sidelines and, taking off a shoe, signing it and giving it to that little boy. That is no longer an ordinary, tennis shoe. That shoe has absorbed something of the magic and the charisma of Steph Curry. It will not be treated as an ordinary shoe any longer. There's zillions examples, of course, of this type of thing. But in a sense, it's that same kind of, we might want to say, kind of philosophical take on the relationship of matter to spirit that's going to inform the way in which God, inhabits the temple. The Israelites had the same kind of notion. You come into Jerusalem and it's not simply some kind of invisible being in the middle of the temple, but everything, around the temple, reflects something of the glory of God. And the early church used this notion, to make a profound point about the relationship of the God who indwelt Jesus of Nazareth, but also was the God who was expressed through his bodily form. And there were many, quote unquote, heretics in the early church who were scandalized by this and wanted to make a division between Christ's bodily, aspect and his divine aspect. And one of the ways in which that, aberrant view was addressed and contested was with through the avenue of temple imagery. And there were good biblical reasons for doing this, because the Gospel of John, the prologue, identifies the incarnation as God tenting, in the logos tenting, that's the skenoo in Greek,
Yep.
literally means to tabernacle, so that the incarnation is understood along the lines of this temple metaphor. So what I suggested in my book is that, this wasn't just a kind of offhand remark. So the early church, when they want to understand, well, what is the relationship to matter and spirit here with respect to the person of Jesus, they went back and looked at the Old Testament. And so Psalm 48 was quite important, and texts like that somehow God's presence in the temple wasn't just some ethereal spirit, but he inhabited the building in such a way that you could, see God through the building.
And I see, you had quoted Raymond Brown on his thoughts on John 1:14, where Brown says, we're being told that the flesh of Jesus Christ is the new localization of God's presence on earth,
Right.
and that Jesus is the replacement of the ancient tabernacle.
Right.
And so as Christians are doing their theology and they're trying to work through their Christology, you also mentioned that there were good exegetical grounds for many of the positions that the church would eventually deem as heretical. What did that look like as they were working through these questions, like how exactly does the temple theology end up fitting in? Because I know eventually the temple view sort of gets eschewed a little bit. Am I correct there?
So it's a complex story. So maybe I'll just backtrack just a second. So if we, because this will lead to where I eventually want to go, if we understand Christ in terms of body and soul being, a living temple, walking around the streets of, Israel, Palestine, well, then, it's not much of a leap to understand Mary also as something of a temple who in her womb held God. Again, the Old Testament here is very valuable. Where seeing God is death dealing. The demands of purity and sanctity that was required of anything that would quote unquote house God in the Old Testament is extraordinary. That's the books of Leviticus and Numbers, witness to that. And again, the church just applied that to Mary. And that's why, again, Mary and her significance within the early church wasn't about Mary, but it was a reflection of the miracle of the incarnation. Her holiness and her sanctity was a reflex of what was required to house God, right? And that's where the Old Testament, of course, was quite important. And we can find, documents very early, the Protevangelium of James being perhaps the most important one in the 2nd century, that's already imagined Mary also as a kind of walking temple. And her veneration then follows from that. But all of this was, greatly accelerated in the 4th century and what's known as the Nestorian controversy, where this temple image became a little bit problematic for thinking about the person of Jesus. It wasn't problematic in the 2nd and 3rd centuries because people hadn't gone down this road, but we know that thinkers like Theodore of Mopsuestia and others imagined the temple metaphor as being God being free to kind of enter and exit this building. So according to Theodore of Mopsuestia, when Christ dies on the cross, his divine aspect leaves. That's how he can eventually die. So in his thinking, one wouldn't kneel or worship before a crucifix, that is a dead or dying Christ on the cross, because he's not God any longer. So that became very problematic. And so as a result, the temple image, 4th century going forward, as a Christological metaphor became more difficult to use because of the way in which it, quote unquote, had been hijacked in this fashion of God entering and leaving at his will and pleasure. That's certainly not an Athanasius, for example, and earlier thinkers who used the image much more productively. But once that, kind of heretical direction is taken, then what we see in the wake of that is a diminishment, we might want to say, of temple imagery applied to Christ, but an amplification of temple imagery now applied to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So a great example to see this are in the hymns, or homilies, I should say, that patristic writers wrote with respect to the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin. My former colleague at the University of Notre Dame, Brian Daly, translated a number of these in a volume out of St. Vladimir's Press. I highly recommend that volume. But if you looked in the index, you would see, the references to Mary as Ark of the Covenant, temple, et cetera, et cetera. They're just, they're all over the place. This becomes one of the favorite ways to talk about her and to identify her. My point in the book isn't that we have to wait for the Nestorian controversy to see this. We've got it already in the 2nd century with the Protevangelium of James, but it, really takes off as a result of this problem.
Very good. And so, I know you'd mentioned that even there were early reformers that had no problem with the idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary, simply because they read the Old Testament and saw her there, right? I think you mentioned Zwingli argues for the perpetual virginity, citing Ezekiel 44.
Right. Actually, that follows the page that you read was 129, I believe. But if you look at the bottom of the page, yes, what's really interesting about what I try to describe here is that this was a natural identification by Zwingli. He was educated in a world in which we might say this figural mode of exegesis was, natural. But modern Protestant thinkers, of course, haven't been, trained in such a mode, and so they can't understand actually the thinking of the reformers. So I say here, at one point in Timothy George, he's a very well-known and highly respected Protestant theologian. He notes that Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli were all in agreement about the perpetual virginity of Mary, even though Scripture makes no explicit judgment on the matter. And then Timothy George says, quote, "Strangely enough, Zwingli attempted to argue for this teaching on the basis of Scripture alone, against the idea that it could only be held on the basis of the teaching authority of the church. His key proof text was Ezekiel 44, verse 2. This gate shall remain shut; it shall not be opened." That's the Virgin Mary's, vaginal canal, as it were. And no one shall enter by it. That's her perpetual virginity, right? For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. That's through the incarnation. But then I conclude this is not nearly as strange as George believes. Zwingli is simply articulating the results of a figural reading of the Bible that goes back to the patristic period. For the fathers of the church, the prediction of the new temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48 had to be understood in light of Mary's obedient response of yes to the angel Gabriel. What's most remarkable about this example is how unintelligible figural exegesis has become over the past few centuries. So that's really the point. And that really just follows from John 1:14. In other words, if Christ we conceive of him as a kind of living, walking temple, then what happened in the early church is they looked at a text like Ezekiel 40 to 48 and saw this as a text about the incarnation. But that's been lost.
So where did that go? I mean, so what was that? Would you suggest that's particularly a movement that comes out of Protestantism, and so it's been lost there, or has that also been lost within Catholic scholarship?
Oh, I think it lost in both, no question. Yeah. I mean, here you'd really have to have a scholar of 19th century Christian theology, the person who really writes, I think, most intelligibly on figural reading, its loss, and then its hope for renewal, is Ephraim Radner, who's a Episcopal thinker. He was a student of George Lindbeck at Yale. Certainly he knew Brevard Childs, and recently retired from a Protestant school of theology in Toronto. But he's written, he's a brilliant man, but has written very, intelligibly and forthrightly about the importance of recovering figural modes of reading.
And so when we're talking about, and again, some people may, be looking at this if they're coming out of a, let's say, more, evangelical Protestant background, where, the idea is you take the text as, it is what it is. It is what it says it is. I don't want to say a literal interpretation, though some would use that. So when we're talking, let's maybe break this down a little bit more. Give some more examples of what we're talking about when we say a figural reading. What does it mean to read figurally? Is that the same as reading typologically?
It can be. So in this instance, I'll give just a couple of examples. This would be exactly that. We would want to say, I would want to say, from a historical critical perspective, I don't think that the prophet Ezekiel thought he was writing about Mary. I think he thought he was writing about, a third temple. But once we get to the moment of the incarnation, the gospel writer, Gospel of John, revealing to us that Christ's appearance is that of a walking temple, then we go back and look at these images like Ezekiel and understand them now in a new way, in a figural way, no longer predicting a third temple, even though that was Ezekiel's thought, but under the insights of the Christian revelation being texts about, the incarnation. We can do the same thing, and I do this in one of my essays in the book about, the quote-unquote doctrine of election. I think we can understand the disciples' inability to understand the messianic office, the beloved son office, maybe a better way to put it, of Jesus in the Gospels by looking back at the Old Testament, especially the stories in the book of Genesis about election and how difficult this concept was for the patriarchs themselves. In other words, this is a kind of common theme across Scripture that, the notion of being an adoptive son of God, a beloved son or daughter of God, is not, a vocation that's immediately obvious to the person who owns it. And the difficulty of the disciples, especially in the Gospel of Mark, but in most of the synoptics, is mirrored figuratively very nicely by, the difficulties that the patriarchs have in the book of Genesis.
Very good. And so it sounds like in a lot of ways, at the end of the day, right, if we're going to read the New Testament well, we have to be fairly well grounded in the Old Testament and in the ideas that the Old Testament present to us. But then at the same time, we're not just reading the Old Testament in its own vacuum. We also have to read that in light, not just of the New Testament, but the way the New Testament and the theology that comes out of the New Testament has been developed and defined by the church moving forward. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, again, here I like Child's insights. I think it's a kind of dialectic. So
Yeah.
the New Testament both, kind of sets a new framework for reading the Old. Ezekiel 40 to 48 would be an excellent example of that. But the Old Testament's what cites what's called its per se voice, its literal sense, also shapes the way in which we understand the New. So that's his point about Isaiah's eschatology. It's not fulfilled, in the person of Jesus Christ, but awaits his second coming. And the notion of a second advent is very much conditioned by the way in which the Old Testament has described its view of the eschaton. So it's both. It's a dialectic. We have to do both things. We go to the New Testament to see how certain key images have been reshaped and reconfigured, but we also go to the Old Testament to pour in content and life into elements that are undertreated in the New. For example, what we would call the hierarchical offices of priest, bishop, and etc.
And let me kind of shameless plug here. You had mentioned the office of priest and the work of understanding that through the Old Testament. I did do an awesome episode with Father Anthony Giambroni. Did you work with him?
Oh, yeah, he was my student. Yeah.
Okay, I had a feeling. He wrote a fantastic book on the Bible and the priesthood.
Right.
And I had him on. Oh, it was great. So we've got an episode, I think it's episode 5. If any listeners want to get that idea more fleshed out, that would be a great place to go. But for what we're talking today with the figural reading, with the idea of the dwelling presence of God in the tabernacle, helping us understand Christology and then Mariology beyond that, and the worthiness of veneration. For a Christian today, how should all of these ideas impact us spiritually? Like what does it look like to live in light of these ideas being true?
Oh my goodness. Well, that takes so many different, shapes and forms. So, I mean, obviously, I think understanding the Bible figuratively has, potentially great benefits for Lectio Divina, reading the story of Jacob, story of Joseph, or even David in light of our own vocation, of being called to be sons or daughters of God is deeply revealing.
And real quick, would you mind? So for those who might not be familiar, what is Lectio Divina?
Lectio Divina is reading the Bible, prayerfully, trying to enter into the world of the Bible. For Ignatius of Loyola, it would be to kind of place yourself in the audience when Jesus, speaks within the New Testament. What would it be like to be standing there? What would you see? What would you hear? What would you think? What would you do? But you can use Lectio Divina for any parts of the Bible, of imagining yourself within the scene as one of the characters, any of the characters, a good character, a bad character. What do you see? What do you feel? Why do you see this? Why do you feel that? It's a way of making the Bible real.
Very good. Well, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I would say, in a lot of ways, we really kind of just scratched the surface on a lot of the depth that you put into the work in this text. So I highly recommend it. One of the things I loved about it is that the chapters are topical. Right, you don't have to read this book cover to cover in order. You are free to bounce around, find the topics that are interesting to you, go straight to those. And I think it's well done, well served for the church. Any concluding thoughts or ideas on your part before we go?
No, thank you very much for having me. I think, we were able to speak to the most important issues of the book, and I'm grateful to have had this opportunity to be, on your show.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I'm hoping to check out your most recent book as well, the book on incarnation and atonement in the tabernacle narrative, just because for me, that is something that fascinates me, God's dwelling presence. And so thank you so much again for being here, and hopefully talk to you again in the future.
Thank you.